The Buddha then traveled to a country far to the west, called Kuru. Accompanied by Ananda, he entered the town of Dhammapāda. Now Ananda was still young, he still did not know the depth of the Buddha's teachings. One day he was sitting under a tree and was thinking on the teachings of the Buddha. As his mind became clearer, Ananda thought that he was able to comprehend the teaching of dependent origination that the Buddha had taught. In his elation, he immediately went to the Buddha and said,
"World-honored one, the principle of dependent origination that you taught us is very deep, but today I have come to understand it."
The Buddha answered,
"O Ananda, you should not speak thus. This principle of dependent origination is very difficult to understand. The reason people are in this world of suffering and affliction is that they cannot understand the principle of dependent origination, which is as difficult to unravel as a mass of tangled threads. O Ananda, decay and death arise because of birth. Birth arises because of becoming. Becoming arises because of attachment. Attachment arises because of desire. Desire arises because of sensation. Sensation arises because of contact. Contact arises because of the 6 organs of sense. The 6 organs of sense arise because of mind and body. Mind and body arise because of consciousness. Consciousness arises because of volition. Volition arises because of ignorance. O Ananda, now I shall explain one of the 12 links of dependent origination. Sensation is the condition for the arising of desire. If there is no sensation, desire does not arise. Sensation is the basis for the arising of desire. Because of desire, the wish to seek arises. From this wish to seek, the wish to obtain arises. Upon obtaining, the choice of good and bad arises. Because of this choice, attachment arises. Because of attachment, jealousy arises. Because of jealousy, greed is increased. Because of greed, we strive to protect our possessions. With canes and swords, we quarrel and fight, slandering each other. All these evils arise. O Ananda, next I shall talk about the ego. The concept that admits the existence of the ego cannot go beyond these 4 views. The ego is material and limited. The ego is material and unlimited. The ego is immaterial and limited. The ego is immaterial and unlimited. Although there are these 4 ways of considering the ego, it is a mistake to consider the ego as having a definite substance. Why? Because the ego only makes its appearance because of various conditions. O Ananda, there are people who say that the ego is identical with sensations. Again, there are people who say that the ego is neither sensations nor perceptions. Again, there are those who say that although the ego is neither sensations nor perceptions, it is the act of sensing and knowing. O Ananda, concerning the idea that the ego is identical with sensations, our sensations are those of suffering, pleasure, or neither suffering nor pleasure. If we have sensations of pleasure, for instance, those sensations of pleasure are not permanent. They are always in a state of change. So, when that pleasure disappears, we would have to say, my ego is no more. Thus, we cannot say that the ego is one with sensations. Again, there are people who say that the ego is neither sensations nor perceptions. But how can they say that the ego exists when there are no sensations nor perceptions? Since they cannot, it cannot be that the ego is neither sensations nor perceptions. Again, there are those who say that the ego is neither sensations nor perceptions but is the act of sensing and knowing itself. However, when all sensations and perceptions are completely extinguished, how can they say that the ego exists? Thus, we must say that all these ideas of the existence of the ego are erroneous. O Ananda, disciples who have rid themselves of these mistaken concepts regarding the ego do not attach themselves to anything in this world, and thus without fear are able to get away from illusion and attain enlightenment.
Ananda greatly rejoiced in this teaching of the Buddha. He returned to the forest and continued his practice of meditation. In the town of Dhammapāda, there lived a Brahmin named Magandiya. He had a daughter named Magandiya, who was very beautiful. This Brahmin was very proud of his daughter's beauty and wanted her to marry a fine young man. One day, by chance, he saw the Buddha walking by the roadside on his alms-receiving mission. Impressed by the striking features of the Buddha, the Brahmin thought that he was a most suitable husband for his daughter. He immediately returned to his home, bringing his wife and daughter with him. He followed the Buddha, but the Buddha had already left the town and entered the grove. The three members of the Brahmin family took note of the footprints left by the Buddha. The wife said,
"This person must have freed himself from all desires. Otherwise, he could not have left behind such orderly and gentle footprints. We must not say anything disrespectful to this venerable personality."
However, the Brahmin did not heed her words of advice. Finding the Buddha sitting under a tree, he went toward the Buddha and said,
"O mendicant, you have already attained your goal through your practices, so why do you not return to your home? My daughter here is very beautiful, as you can see. If you will consent to take her as your wife, we shall consider it a great honor and it will make us very happy."
The Buddha answered,
O Brahmin, I do not have anything to do even with a heavenly maiden, much less with a woman filled with foul-smelling pus. What would I want with such a woman?
However, the daughter was as conceited as a peacock and was too obstinate to be soaked through with the rain of the Dharma. She felt maligned when her beauteous appearance was called a polluted body filled with pus, and her wounded mind secretly vowed to take revenge. Soon afterwards, the Brahmin couple entered the Sangha. The daughter became the first queen consort of King Nidāna of Kaushambi, who was struck by her beauty at first sight. People began to question the whereabouts of the Buddha. When they heard from Anuruddha that the Buddha would return 3 months after his ascending to the Trayatrincha heaven, they were eagerly looking forward to his return. The Buddha spent the year's retreat in Trayatrincha heaven. Then, around the end of November, he decided to descend to Samkasa. Indra ordered Visakhama to make 3 jeweled stairways. That day, the Buddha put his foot on the center golden stairway. Brahma, holding a white whisk on the Buddha's right side, stepped down on the silver steps. Indra, carrying a jeweled umbrella on the Buddha's left side, stepped down on the crystal steps. The gods followed, flying in the air and praising the virtues of the Buddha. The first one who knew of the descent of the Buddha was a nun by the name of Utpalavarna, who was considered the first in superhuman powers among the nuns. She immediately changed herself into the form of the great wheel-turning king and welcomed the Buddha. However, she was not the first person to welcome the Buddha. At this time, Subhuti was sewing his robes in a cave on Vulture Peak outside of Rajagriha, which was several hundred miles east of the city of Samkasa. With the thought of welcoming the Buddha, Subhuti put to one side the robes that he had been sewing and started to stand up. As his right knee touched the ground, the following thoughts occurred in his mind.
Just what is the form of the Buddha whom I was about to welcome? This form of the Buddha is composed of matter. Is not my body also composed of matter? All these things are empty. There is no creator, there is nothing created. In paying homage to the Buddha, I pay homage to the impermanence and inconstancy of body and mind. In paying homage to the Buddha, I pay homage to the emptiness of all things. In paying homage to the Buddha, I pay homage to the lack of self in all things. I do not exist, there is no creator, nor is there anything created, everything is empty. I pay homage to the true Dharma.
Returning to his seat, Subhuti commenced sewing his robes again. When the Buddha returned to his disciples, he said to Utpalavarna,
O Utpalavarna, you are not the first to see me. Subhuti, seeing the true nature of things as empty, was the first to see me. He who sees my body is not the one who sees me. He who sees the Dharma is the one who sees me.
At Samkasa, the disciple Shariputra became the leader and was teaching the disciples and the laymen. Now, when the Buddha stepped down the jeweled steps and was about to put his feet on the ground, Shariputra stepped forward and said,
World-honored one, I welcome you. Today all the people are rejoicing at your return.
The Buddha answered,
O Shariputra, You are very fortunate to rejoice for a person who has cut off all defilements and attained enlightenment and release.
And many attained enlightenment by hearing this conversation between the Buddha and Shariputra.